Latina Show.
Hosted by IEM.
And we are live. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
Hello, our technical genius, Marcelo, who is responsible for this whole thing
For all
rolling.
the mess that goes around.
I'm just a talking head with a little bit of information, but the true technical genius is, of course, you. So welcome to episode 2 of the Winter Latina Show by Nina Byzantina. That's too many things that rhyme, but it just kind of worked out this way. Hopefully the one person who is watching us, well, hopefully 1 million, right? We're aiming for about 1 million, although that might crash your computer. Hopefully everyone who is watching appreciates our sort of attempts to cover both historical subjects, but also kind of more current political and cultural things going on around the world, which is why we chose to discuss the situation with the Orthodox Church, primarily in Ukraine. So hopefully This would be elucidating for everyone.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of subjects. Just about 1 hour before we get together here to go online, I was talking to Lucas Leroy's, who is part of the New Resistance in Brazil. And I just told him, we're going to talk about the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And he was like, awesome topic. We are also having a program. So now I'm going to push a little bit of sardine for my side.
Things seems to keep happening, right? And they're pretty bad things, which is why, you feel like you've sort of covered it. I wrote an article about it last year thinking, okay, it's kind of current. I can always have people refer back to it if they're asking for my opinion on it. And then things keep happening, and they're not good things. So we're definitely, up for discussing this topic. And we're obviously avoiding the elephant in the room, a certain American journalist who went to Moscow because, well, first of all, everyone's disgusted. Second, for me as a, Russian in North America, I don't want, men in black showing up on my doorstep. Should I have an opinion about that topic? My opinion. So we're going to ignore that topic because everyone has already talked about it. But I'll just express my opinion that it's a very amusing situation with having someone ask questions addressed to a leader of another country. It's actually kind of mind-blowing. But we're going to ignore that particular elephant in the room. We'll leave it up to others who are not Russians in North America to discuss
but
this topic.
If you want to know my opinion, follow us on Twitter.
Yes,
or X,
definitely.
X.
Yes, on X, we're not allowed to say the T word, right? Elon, please do not come after us. And yes, follow Marcelo, the technical genius. Obviously, he's doing a lot for launching or, trying to establish these interesting alternative viewpoints, but specifically within this multipolar framework, right? Talking to people from not obviously necessarily BRICS countries, but other countries or people who have different opinions living within the official West. I know that's a loaded term, so definitely follow Marcelo. It might be in Portuguese, it might be in English, it might be in multiple languages.
That's the fun part of our channel. It's always a surprise. The other day it was Italian, then some English from China, and then some, French and Russian every now and then as well.
Right, that kind of feeds into the whole multipolar framework. But why don't we get started? So the reason why we decided to talk about the crackdown, the persecution of the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine is the most recent attack that targeted a prominent figure in Western Ukraine, in Junte-se, and he's, I believe he's of Romanian descent, although if you look at his posts, he posts in the official church page posts in Ukrainian and posts sometimes in Russian and then posts a lot in Romanian. So that actually kind of shows you the power of the Orthodox Church and where it's active. And this particular priest, he is a metropolitan, so he's highly positioned. He was and is known in the media as someone who has adopted over 400 children within the framework of his monastery in Chernovtsi in Western Ukraine. So he's definitely known for this, this significant level of charity, obviously taking care of 400 orphans. I'm not sure if they're all orphans or if there's some certain other parental issues going on is, a significant feat. So just a few days ago, he, the church page posted an image with severe facial injuries, as if, he's experienced severe blunt force trauma on their page without much of an explanation other than saying that this is the price for maintaining I guess they use the word purity of the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And then they specified the next day when I guess the priest was ready to actually discuss what had happened. And he said that in the middle of the night, someone knocked on his door. And of course, he's sort of, I'm not sure if he's required to open a door at 3 o'clock in the morning, but of course, because he is, he's a member of clergy, he probably feels that someone might be asking for help. And he was basically attacked at his doorstep. He was hit so hard that he fainted, and he ended up in a hospital. I think his first address after this has happened, he had to wear shades, he had to wear sunglasses at church because the facial injuries were so bad. And of course, he tries to maintain a positive attitude, saying that he's okay. But you have to look at this in a greater context. This particular priest has been there's been sort of criminal charges brought against him because he is part of the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And people usually think of the crackdown starting after when the escalation occurred, right, in February 2022. But for sort of the modern period, we really have to go back to the early 1990s, sort of immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then to look at the broader context, we have to go back centuries prior, right, to sort of more historically relevant events from, believe it or not, it might be 500 years ago. So
I think in the first show in our channel, I actually asked you that me and my friend Dima, Russian friend that I have, we were going back to, Napoleon and then whatever, the Crusaders. And at some point we were just, okay, so all this started with the breakup with the Roman Catholic Church, with the Byzantine Church.
It certainly is a context, right? I mean, you can sort of choose how much to focus on that because there are other more modern, perhaps more relevant issues going on. But certainly, even here, you can talk about the schism in 1054 between what became the Catholic Church and what today is known as the Orthodox Church. So you can certainly go back that far, specifically in the context. Well, let's go back to the 90s first, and then we can sort of look at this broader context. So as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this resurgence of Christianity, because in the Soviet Union officially, it was an atheist state. Of course, religion was still being practiced, especially after, in the early 1940s, in the context of World War II, Stalin essentially sanctioned the ability to practice Christianity. So he sort of softened on the Bolshevik crackdown in the 20s and 30s that we can also come back to. But basically, there was that religious undercurrent, but of course, officially, the Soviet Union was a secular state. And so you didn't really have such a prominent role of the church that you did, prior to 1917 revolution. So because this has been, a tradition that has existed in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, et cetera, for, 1,000 years, of course, that tradition never died in sort of that more secular framework. And it came back as soon as essentially the Soviet Union dissolved. But the issue with a place like Ukraine, we talked about this on your show earlier, where it sort of included lands that were attached to the modern Ukrainian state includes lands that were attached from other places, right? So you have Hungary, Romania in the west, you have parts of what has been historically Russia in the east, which of course, that doesn't mean that the state cannot function as this new entity, but if you're going to have such a multi-religious, multicultural state, you're going to have to incorporate, right, these people with different traditions. Yeah, you're going to sort of incorporate them, and you're going to perhaps follow some kind of federalization. There are different ways of doing that, right? And of course, these are the people that have been there. This is a little bit, well, not a little bit, it really is a different context than, let's say, mass migration due to war, refugees coming to, let's say, Europe. That is a different context, even though in some ways it might be similar, because once again, you're trying to assimilate or incorporate or somehow consolidate the state with new people. So in the case of Ukraine, you basically had this historic split that we can sort of go back to, where in the west, sort of in the far west, closer to Poland, you have the what is known as the Greek Catholic Church. So they're basically following, to make it simple, they're following Byzantine or East Roman, right, Orthodox rites, but they are Catholics. And that happened in the 16th century. And they sort of consider, or some of them consider themselves to be the true representatives of Ukraine, even though they're a minority church. So that's also interesting, because what we've had since the Maidan is the imposition of the Western identity onto all of Ukraine, which is a minority identity, onto the entire country, which usually, doesn't work. And of course, it's been done with such a forceful way. It's not just an imposition of the general Western identity, it's the imposition of certain, sketchy characters from World War II that we talked about earlier. We don't have to go into this detail today. But, and then you had sort of the dominant Orthodox church, the canonical Orthodox church in Ukraine, in the east, in the south, in the center, right, in Kiev. And that church has been part of the Moscow Patriarchate. So there's that automatic issue with the church belonging to sort of the Russian Patriarch in the context of Ukraine slowly and then really fast trying to remove itself from any kind of connections to Russia, historical, cultural, linguistic, just on steroids, to the point where it's completely illogical, where they'd be removing statues of poets, even though this is not like a military leader that could be offensive in some shape or form. So as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved, what you had is I think it was like, the statistic I saw was thousands of police that were sort of assigned to oversee what was happening. And that was a violent, in some cases, takeover of the Orthodox churches in some parts, especially sort of in the West, but not necessarily, of Ukraine by the other denominations, like the Greek Catholics. So they would sort of come in, they would just squat in the church or violently take it over. Some people would be assaulted. I mean, there's just dozens of these cases if you actually go and follow over, 30 years since the 90s, the situation. So it's something even in the modern period that has roots back then, as opposed to in the current rendition of the conflict, although you can say the conflict itself, of course, has other earlier versions as well. So the escalation occurred in 2014. So for those of us who've been paying attention to the regime change, right, in my opinion, I'm saying this for legal reasons, people think it's some people, of course, still think it's this wonderful democratic thing that happened peacefully, et cetera, et cetera. In my opinion, it was a violent regime change. I believe the recent court ruling in Ukraine itself sort of showed that it was a regime change, because they...
Exactly, I was about to say that.
Snipers were actually attacking protesters that were... the snipers were in the Maidan control areas. Again, that's a different subject, but I think when you kind of have bits and pieces of information making it into the mainstream, that essentially shows what we've been screaming about for a decade now. It's really...
Just to point out, there is actually an Italian documentary from 2000. 16 or 17, if I'm not mistaken. It's a TV documentary. It's like 30 minutes. It's on YouTube, and it exposed like the Georgian snipers and all the shady things that were happening. That of course has gone to forgiveness, to forgetness. But there is this documentary. It's on YouTube. I think I have it posted on Twitter. I will repost it because I think it's always good to remember those things.
Oliver Stone did the same thing or a similar thing when he discussed that.
But this one is very specific about the snipers shooting. The things that were happening behind the scenes that made no sense at all. And to show it was a regime change. Oliver Stone's is fantastic. You have BBC documentaries. I mean, 4 or 5 all from each year. You have one talking about the raising of the far right in Ukraine. So all these things is not in the memory hole.
It's there, on YouTube. Right? It's on YouTube.
It's on
Twitter,
BBC official page. It's not removed.
Of course, yeah. It's very interesting how you had this massive censorship going on as soon as the escalation happened in 2022, but all the content is still there. It's for you to find. So it's really a little bit schizophrenic, for the lack of a better word, to simultaneously claim this one thing while still having this historical footage from not too long ago. But yes, absolutely. But when that escalation happened with the 2014 Maidan, and essentially the East and the South rebelled, and then the so-called anti-terrorist operation was launched, which turned into what we now call the war in Donbass. Statistically, in about the first 6 months of that war, the statistics I saw, it was like 62 churches were either damaged or destroyed in the shelling or bombings, there was a couple of airstrikes too in the beginning coming from the Kiev side. That is a huge number. I mean, you could say that initially, some of them may have been collateral damage because that's, it's war, this happens. But when you get such a huge number, 62, or I mean, it doesn't have to be 62, it can be 45, it's dozens, right? And it no longer seems like it's an accident that so many churches have been damaged. And I just remember following it when it was happening. In some of those cases, it was civilians taking refuge in a church to escape from the shelling. That might remind you of a certain other conflict going on in the Middle East when a certain other historic church partly was attacked. So a very kind of clear situation where civilians are hiding in the church and then the church is on fire because it's been struck. So when you kind of look at that, it no longer starts to seem in that greater context of taking over church properties of the Orthodox Church, of trying to disassociate yourself from the Orthodox Church, because it has that relationship with the Moscow Patriarchate historically. It no longer starts to seem accidental. And so then just a few years later, I believe it's in 2019, they essentially, a certain segment of the canonical Orthodox Church broke away, and they deliberately chose a very similar name so that when you're reading in the news, it gets confusing, because one is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the breakaway schismatic church. Most of the Orthodox do not recognize it, and I'll talk about that in a second. They call themselves the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So it's very confusing when you see the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. You think, oh, someone is just using synonyms to describe the same entity, which they're not.
It reminds me of Monty Python's movie, you have the People Liberation Army and
exactly.
The Army of People for Liberation.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable how accurate Monty Python, I guess that was like the late 70s, wasn't it? I mean, it's...
or 60s, it's Life of Brian.
Right, it's kind of amazing how that, all their content really aged well, and it's in some ways more relevant today than it was when it first came out, because of the paradoxes and the absurdities of, the postmodern world in which we live. But yes, it's definitely like the People Liberation Front, and it's done deliberately. I mean, you can't claim that it's not, because you get confused when you're reading about them. And so basically, the one major entity that recognized the schismatic church is the Patriarch of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarch. Now, that particular patriarch, I mean, you could just kind of Google his name, Bartholomew, and look at his pictures. He's constantly chilling with the official Western leaders, which is, not to say that it's wrong to meet with people, leaders from different countries, but in my opinion,
But not every day.
Not every day. He seems to be quite compromised, especially the types of leaders that he's meeting with. And after he meets with them, all of a sudden, he recognizes the schismatic church that almost no one else does. And
it's amazing how much of these leaders end up in Turkey, right?
Yes, all of a sudden
we just had a chat with
mm-hmm.
Carl Zah about the Uyghurs and also the Uyghur command center, and also with Angelo Giuliano and
right.
the what's the name of the guy, the Buddhist leader, the
Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama also went to Turkey. Well, okay. Just to print a picture here.
No, I understand. It's obviously it's a different but a related scenario where everyone just thinks, all of these Western officials think Bartholomew is just an amazing dude to hang out with. He's just such a cool leader in Constantinople.
Orthodox leader.
Yeah, in the historical part of the Byzantine/East Roman world. Someone is going to attack me that I use the word Byzantine. Someone else is going to say, no, don't say East Roman. So just for the record, it doesn't matter. It's nomenclature, and I don't care. But anyway, so it's really interesting how they would meet with this church leader in Constantinople, and then he would make decisions that would benefit the said leader's politics. And of course, there are a bunch of interpretations. Some people say that he is just recognizing a new entity that naturally arose, which of course it didn't naturally arise. Others say that he's trying to sort of take a chunk of what would have been controlled by the Russian patriarchate. So, you can sort of use your own judgment to interpret what's happening. I certainly have strong opinions about the fact. But the other interesting thing about this schismatic church, in addition to the fact that it's largely unrecognized, is some of these bizarre imagery, that's been popping up in different churches. I mean, they're using religious imagery, whether it's frescoes or icons, things that are meant for a very particular purpose in a religious institution in the Orthodox Church, right? They would be using members of the, the Galician SS unit in a fresco, or some of these extreme Banderite nationalists that would be in icons or something like that. There's a huge record. I mean, I've posted I was going to say I tweeted it out, but I'm saying I posted on my social media repeatedly. It's very easy to find. There are websites that show what these images look like, but they're not just iconoclastic, where you probably shouldn't be putting these people. It goes beyond that, right? It goes to a very toxic political ideology that was specific to that region in collaboration with Nazi Germany. And these people are being glorified, but not just being glorified in a plaque or a street name, as is what is happening anyway. They're being glorified in this quasi-religious context. I mean, they don't have halos, but why are they even in a fresco? So you kind of have that other undercurrent that is completely bizarre to this breakaway schismatic church. And they also have this other issue where that schismatic church has been really friendly with the Greek Catholics, which is not to say that you shouldn't have some kind of inter-religious communication. Other people do this in today's day and age, but there is this idea, some people claim, you can call them conspiracy theorists, that the two are going to join, and that would be the way for sort of the Western Church to acquire legally all these properties that have for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, belonged to the canonical Orthodox Church. And of course, on top of that, you have the violence. You have the persecution of these priests. In the context of the Donbass war, some of them have been injured or killed. Again, there's a record. You can find it in English. I've occasionally posted about this myself. You also have something like the recent attack, where it's in the context of outright physical intimidation. I mean, if you're going to physically assault a priest to silence him in some shape or form, I mean, I don't know how else you can interpret that. And then you have this additional crackdown by the state, right? You have the criminal investigations launched against some of these church leaders, against some of the churches. So the attempts to acquire the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, which is like a historic, very old historical building, really important to acquire and take it away from the canonical Orthodox Church. So you have to look at all of these things in context. So you can make it into an even broader context. You can talk about the persecution of Christians in general. Like if you think about the Middle East and Christians that existed in Iraq that are essentially gone because of the Iraq war, you know, Christians in Syria that have been persecuted thanks to the moderate rebel, big air quotes, type groups that have arisen since the
huge air quotes, please.
Conflict, of course, right. So you can make it an even broader situation where these religious groups and these religious issues are being used to benefit someone else at the expense of sort of regular, everyday practitioners of this religion. So,
yeah. Well, religion is it's a very well-known tool for mass mobilization. That was we already discussed it a couple of times here in the channel with you. The things about the Stalinism and the things that the Soviet Union had to adopt because they didn't. The communists didn't want religion, but at the same time, people were going religious anyway. And at some point, they just found out. They just saw what was obvious, that people, separate completely, breaking out the state from the religion was a big mistake, because the church would, of course, be against it, because every church also has its own interests, and so the best idea was to coexist peacefully. Even if, slightly underground, as we mentioned, that, it was forbidden, but people just looked the other way. And one of the things on Putin's recent address that he phrased the fact that Russia is an Orthodox country. That's important. We had here in the channel, we had 2 chats with Lucas. There was an amazing talk with Lucas, who is an Orthodox Christian, Brazilian. And he explained, because that's something that we don't hear in Brazil. So we don't know anything about Orthodox Christianity in Brazil. Anything. It's you don't hear anything about that. And then we had a talk with Rafael Machado, who is someone who studies the fourth political theory from Dugin. And one of the points that both of them make, and I mean, one is Orthodox Christian and the other one is almost atheist. I'm not sure. I'm just shooting. Maybe I'm assuming. Well, he's not Christian. Let's put it like that. So I don't know if he has other. We didn't got to that point. But the common ground there is that, the main, so even the Lucas mentioned the fact that there is the almost religiosus, I would say like that, the religious man, the religious homo sapiens, like that, which means that basically, and that's something that I always thought, by observing here in Europe, the behavior of, removing religion from the people without a substitution.
Right,
Because,
and then you have this quasi-religious treatment of all these socio-cultural issues, right? Any of this, any of the gender spectrum stuff, people treat it like, it doesn't matter, it could be climate, right?
They,
all of
they
those
just
sort
got,
of
exactly, they just got lost.
Right, they're being
They just
treated
need something.
not as a rational subject for debate, and not even simply emotional. Certainly people who are very invested in those topics get very emotional, but it's more than that. They treat it almost like a new religion. And I mean, I know many people have talked about this liberalism or post-liberal ideology being this, essentially providing these replacements for would have been religious, because to me, humans are religious beings. So like you're saying, if there's a vacuum, by creating a secular space, something has to come there.
Of power ever.
And what has come in there, as you're saying, in, let's say parts of secular Europe, I would say it probably applies more to cities than more sort of rural environments, and probably in other places too, is this bizarre concoction of political ideology mixed with very kind of surface-based issues that sort of relate more to the types of language that we use, as opposed to any kind of tangible, let's say, rights for people. And the way people relate to them is in this quasi-religious skewed way. So it goes beyond just having an emotional investment and having, the ability of rationally analyze them. So definitely that's what's happened in Europe. And so that, I think it just shows you that, again, humans are religious animals, for the lack of a better word. So something needs to be there. And when you take away a tradition that has been embedded for centuries, if not millennia, then the thing that comes in
something else gets into place.
It's either going to be something else, or it's going to be something else that's very noxious, which I think many parts of, the liberal, or if you want to call it post-liberal ideology since the Cold War, because it's the only really modern ideology that has, exists on a grand global scale. It's definitely very, very skewed. So I think it's important to also, this is a much even broader context, right, than talking about the persecution of Christians in Ukraine, in the world. Sure. And then we're talking about ideologies and how the perception of religion fits into that narrative, for sure. So
yeah, but reading your article, some things caught my attention. Well, first thing was the fact that, well, as I said before here in the channel, I know some Ukrainians that live nearby here, and most of the things that started to happen and started to be denied that were happening by the Western media. So these acquaintances, they were telling me all that for much longer before the start of the SMO. So it's just logic. So they were from there, they fled from there, or they left, they immigrated from there, doesn't matter, much before. And all of them told me more or less the same thing: the corruption, the persecutions, how's it called? Forbidding of the Russian language being used in
the banning of the Russian language. Sure, yeah,
exactly. So all of these things, they told me before it happened. And then, as I said, one day, 24th February 2022, I turned on the TV. No, that never happened there.
Right.
Okay, right.
Which is it's just the level of, again, to use the modern term, gaslighting is really quite impressive, because, as you mentioned earlier, the record is still there. It hasn't all been sort of wiped clean off the internet. So you can sort of go back. If you know what you're looking for, of course, the general public isn't going to look for this stuff because, well, they, first of all, might be true believers. Second, they might not be this invested, other than what, the mainstream media is feeding them. But people who sort of have a certain interest in politics, right, in international relations and foreign policy, they can go look for themselves and see what the Western media that can't be accused of being pro-Russian, like the BBC. If anything, it's wildly anti-Russian. But if the BBC is reporting some of these things, CNN from 2014 onward, you can go back and look, and you'll definitely find a lot of that information there. To sort of, if you needed an outside source that wasn't, me or you or someone who has more of an interest, right, in these questions, in these topics, for sure.
Yeah, what caught my attention was in your article, which, by the way, I forgot to put on the description, but I will.
No worries.
So one point that you mentioned is the absence of tools, of state tools to make this coexistence, which was what we were just talking about, the coexistence possible. I mean, not only that, but also they were building tools to, break out this coexistence. And then one thing that caught my attention was a quote by that you put on the article by the patriarch Kirill, where he kind of points the fact that everybody is kind of blaming the West or the outside powers for the situation, but there was already something going on inside there, and talking about also the Greek church and the Ukrainian church. So can you please extrapolate a little bit about that, because that got
this is sort of what I talked about earlier. So initially, we can go back in history. We can go to the initial to 988, right? This is when ancient Rus, which we can also call Kievan Rus, right, adopted what became Orthodox Christianity with Vladimir the Great. And obviously at that time, we can be diplomatic and say it was neither Russia nor Ukraine nor Belarus. It was this East Slavic entity, right, that existed. And today, right, some of the cities today belong to Ukraine, like Kiev, but then other parts of that state, like Novgorod, right, belong to Russia. That tells you that it was sort of equally shared by these descendants, at least the political entities. And so that was, obviously prior to that, the East Slavic entity was pagan. And obviously when a political leader adopts a new religion, he has his own, it's not necessarily this beautiful religious conversion, right? Some people believe that's what it was. Other people would make arguments of, well, of course, this is going to bring him closer to Constantinople, improve those ties. There is some intermarriage. You all of a sudden have all these, I guess they're not frescoes. They're doing mosaics, right, coming into Kiev to create these new beautiful churches. So you can kind of draw your own conclusion what was the dominant motivation for Vladimir to adopt this religion. But be that as it may, it became sort of the dominant religion for the East Slavic people at this time. And then with the Mongol invasion, which happened in the 13th century, sort of 1238 and 1242, you essentially had the splintering of the state. On top of that, of course, by then there was already infighting between the different princes, which exacerbated the situation. So essentially what was Kievan Rus splintered into separate principalities that were quite weak. And you still had religion, what today we call Orthodox Christianity, being maintained as is in all of the principalities separately. But by the end of the 16th century, especially in the West, where the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was quite powerful, the church that was the Orthodox Church accepted a union with the Catholic Church, and they became the Greek Catholics. So they kind of maintained all the trappings, like all the rights that they've been using, but they became Catholic. And so, some people like to go back. We also call it, in Russian, we call it the Union Church. In English, I think it's less common. It's just referred to as Greek Catholics. But basically, some people also like to look at that point as sort of a major schism. So you could sort of maybe I call it the first schism in my article. You can call the initial splintering between what became Catholics and the Orthodox in 1054. But as far as Ukraine goes, like the modern territory of Ukraine, that would be the first schism, where all of a sudden these Byzantines, these Orthodox became Catholics. But the Orthodox Church survived in that region. And interestingly, it probably, even though it's sort of, I don't know if it's really the minority. I think there's a significant number of Orthodox in what today is Western Ukraine, but in some ways they're almost, because they kind of had this challenge of facing other religions and hostilities, in many ways, they are almost more invested in maintaining their religion and cultural traditions than, let's say, people where Orthodoxy was more dominant, which happens, of course, sometimes. You can look at Christians in and Egypt for something, or or whatever, other parts of the Middle East where they're a minority and they're very invested in maintaining their roots, cultural, religious traditions, etc. So some people like to go back to that period as the roots of the schism, and that's what the Patriarch Kirill referred to, right? He referred to the Greek Catholic Church, and I don't want to say the entire Greek Catholic Church is doing this, but definitely many of the takeovers were happening from Greek Catholics trying to take over Orthodox churches, Orthodox properties, et cetera, et cetera. So there's certainly a certain impression that can be formed by looking at that. So this is what he was referring to. Yes, so of course you can't blame the West for everything. There are some internal things going on. There are some individual people that are interested in taking over these churches. I'm just going to pull up my article because if you remember some of my poll quotes, right, it was a pretty striking statement, right? Quote, "We will not cast pearls before you, Muscovite swine. You're a powerless biomass. We will not only take this church from you, but we will also take everything. We will kick you out from our land and from the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra." And this is 2017. So this is before the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra was in the news, like it was last year, where it was being taken over. So, when you're referring to the Orthodox as a powerless biomass, so not even humans, and when you're, casting pearls before swine, it kind of tells you this was a Greek Catholic priest in Ivano-Frankovsk in Western Ukraine, which, I have it cited on the article that you're referring to. So, I mean, that just kind of, again, not to say that every single priest in a Greek Catholic church is acting in this way, of course, but this does show a pattern of behavior that we have seen since the 1990s. So that is what the Patriarch was referring to.
Yeah, but so what I keep thinking about is where does it go? Where does it go from here?
Well, some other people, we can go back to the Soviet Union, and that I sort of like to look at all periods in Russian history equally. Some, every period has negative features and positive features, and the Soviet Union had many, many, many positive features, which a lot of Westerners either deliberately ignore or they're not aware of. But one of the negative features was, of course, the persecution of the church, right, that took place in the 1920s into the 1930s. And of course, I am a descendant of priests for several generations. I haven't actually traced it back farther, but I can probably keep going, and it's going to be priests. You may not know, in Orthodoxy, some priests are allowed to get married, like in Protestantism. Not every priest. They're sort of, in Russian, we call them sort of the white priesthood and the black priesthood, and the black priesthood is the monks, right? So monks are not allowed to marry. They're supposed to stay celibate, and they're the ones that are able to rise up the hierarchy all the way up. Whereas the white priesthood aren't allowed to rise up, but they still can have important positions in the community. And so even though I'm not sort of I'm not a poster girl for Orthodox Christianity, I'm not following every single fast to a T. I've never done, let's say, a full fast because I'm very athletic and I will not be able to have enough energy if I were to do the vegan diet, et cetera, et cetera. So, but at the same time, not just because I'm from Russia and because I also have roots from the Caucasus, both of which are, Orthodox locations, but because I have this specific family tradition. To me, it's very important to maintain those traditions, sort of almost like I'm thinking of my ancestors. But specifically, we talked about my great-grandfather, who was a prominent church leader in Tbilisi, Georgia, and he was offered basically a position of leading the faculty of philosophy in the University of Tbilisi if he were to publicly renounce his religion. And he talked to his family. He decided he was not going to take this perk. He was not going to publicly renounce, what he believed in. And he was taken away. And from what we understand, we've got some records. It was sort of family lore, but we had confirmation, in probably the 90s, 2000s. I'm not sure exactly when my mother received the official documents from the church. I can actually find them online today. He was shot right in his jail cell. So he's he's considered to be a new martyr. I'm not sure if you know that all the people that were all the clergy that were executed at that time, they're considered, I guess, a saint, right? They're considered a martyr. So technically I descend from a saint, making this a little bit more humorous. But when I kind of have this family tradition, well, first of all, it's very obviously difficult to reconcile in some ways my great admiration for the Soviet Union with this revolutionary period that had violence, right? And we talked about this before, where traditional periodization says 1917, the revolution, 1922, the Civil War was over, now it's peaceful and it's a new state. I look at that periodization differently. There was massive consolidation going on up until World War II. So I extend the revolutionary period until essentially, the start of World War II, when the country was really consolidated partly because of the war effort, sort of this baptism by fire. But obviously, when you have a revolutionary period, we talked about this earlier, revolutions are inherently violent in most cases. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. So the violence of the early Soviet state kind of fits into that perception. But of course, if you look at individual family histories, you can understand it, but also you can be horrified by sort of individual cases that had happened. And so some people, the reason I'm going back to this is that some people like to look at the persecution of the church in Ukraine today and compare it to sort of the early Bolsheviks, which, in some ways it is an accurate comparison to a certain point, and in some ways it's inaccurate because the Bolsheviks had a very particular ideology to which they subscribed, and the people in Ukraine or their puppet masters they do not share that ideology. They're not Bolsheviks. They are liberals. They're post-liberals. They have a very different ideology with individual at the center who is completely void of having any roots to culture, religion, community, et cetera, sort of this autonomous human unit, as I like to call it. And that's very, very different from the sort of the communal ideology of the Bolsheviks. But that is why the communal ideology of the Bolsheviks and then, later sort of the socialists, the communists, however you want to call them in the USSR, you had sort of two levels to this. Now, the church was obviously an authority, right? So if you're a new authority, revolutionary authority, you don't want someone else to have that authority, right? You want them to be under you, which is of course what happened with, Stalin re-sanctioning the church sort of at a lower level, kind of allowing it to exist, but it was no longer the authority that it was before.
But stay there.
Yeah, stay there. Whereas, of course, the Bolsheviks completely banned it. So Stalin he was much more shrewd in understanding of that you cannot completely remove people's traditions. He himself, came from sort of a priestly background. So that's really interesting. But if we sort of look at it in an even more ideological way, Bolsheviks had the idea of this end time, and the end time would be a stateless society, right? Sort of using Marxist predictions, which Marx was very kind of vague about those predictions, but basically the idea of, the erosion of the state, a stateless society, classless society, et cetera, et cetera. So they had that end point. Whereas in Christianity, there is that other eschatology, right, of the end times of, it's not a cyclical view of history. It's a kind of a linear view up until a certain point. So you have two very competing viewpoints, one in a religious context and one in a secular ideological, Marxist context, and they were clashing. So this is the other sort of more profound reason why the two were in conflict. It wasn't just about the who is the authority, who is in charge right now. We've had a revolution, it's now us. It was also about that sort of deeper eschatological perception of where is the world going, where is society going, what are the end times, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of had that context. But I did want to emphasize, because whenever I post about this, the persecution of the church in Ukraine, there's always someone that comes out of the woodwork saying, oh, they're just all Bolsheviks. And ideologically, that is just, I understand that you want to sort of fling insults and you're angry, and the emotional response is understandable, but it's completely wrong to refer to someone who is clearly, who clearly subscribes to a liberal ideology with a very different focal point, to call them Bolsheviks. You can make that comparison to say, okay, in the 1920s and 30s, we had the persecution of the church, and now we have the persecution of the church. So there's some similarities and differences, but you cannot attribute a different ideology to what's happening today And of course, you know, the geopolitical context is different as well. So I really wanted to sort of to clarify that.
Yeah, cool. That's a perfect picture, I think. But can we maybe fast forward a little bit to what you call in your article the second schism?
Second schism. Mm-hmm.
It's my bad English.
No worries. Well, this is what I mentioned in the beginning. I have it on my iPad in front of me. That's why I'm scrolling right now. This is what I mentioned, right? And it sort of had those roots in the 90s. Then in 2018, I apologize, there was that church that was established with a very similar name, right? The Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which can be confused with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And it's, like I said, it's been sanctioned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, who likes to chill with all these Western figureheads, and a little more often than a religious leader would. Again, it's technically there's nothing wrong with meeting with these officials, but when you meet with them a lot and then you kind of do what fits their political agenda, we can at least, you know, put on our tinfoil hats and arrive at certain suspicious conclusions. Maybe we're wrong, but something's definitely going on there, even if it's his own personal power, desire for power, and acquiring all these new, you know, these churches in the East. What for him would be the East.
There you have a problem. As I mentioned that I had this conversation with Lucas, he also explained to me all this approximation from the Ukrainian church to the Constantinople church, and so he explained deeper. I have to say that it's not that I didn't understand, but I don't remember what were the names, you know, that you have this kind of conclave that, so for the church to be recognized, you need another kind, what's it called? Another nucleus of church to recognize this church.
Right. There's a particular, yes, there's definitely a very specific
the procedure to
yes,
recognize.
It's very procedural, right? It's very procedural, which is why it's interesting that mostly it has not been recognized by other churches. Like I said, there are some exceptions, the Constantinople Patriarch being the most notable exception. So it's interesting that he sort of broke the procedure to do this. And again, very, 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 very sketchy.
That's exactly what he explained, that he broke the procedure. And of course, this comes from the fact that the Orthodox Church is not centralized to the Pope or to like the Catholic Church has its, you know, central
authority.
Authority, exactly.
Right.
So you have this kind of, you can break out from here and then join there. It's a bit complex for me to understand, but I think the point was that one. And
I don't think you really need to understand the specifics of the procedure. You can certainly find it, how it was done, but you just have to remember that he did not follow the procedure for doing something like that, for establishing a new church, right? A new entity within Orthodoxy. But, you know, to answer your question, where it goes from here, I mean, if Orthodoxy could survive in the 1920s and 30s, why wouldn't it survive today? You know, I don't think Zelensky. Right. I don't think. I mean, it's in some ways it's becoming more popular because of the persecution. I mean, this is how Christianity was born, right? Out of persecution, in part, in terms of its popularity. But I mean, I don't see Zelensky ending up better than Georgia's former leader Saakashvili, who sort of had his different appointments and is now imprisoned by his own people. I mean, at best, that might be Zelensky's fate. Of course, he's not the first one who started a crackdown. Poroshenko, right, the previous president who escalated the war in Donbass, he was very much embedded with the new schismatic, quote unquote, church. But of course, you can go back and Google pictures from him when he is happily participating on all the canonical Orthodox festivities. So there's that idea of politicians kind of doing whatever fits their agenda and whatever makes them popular in this quote unquote, right, democratic world in terms of making themselves likable by the general population. But yes, I mean, even though it's the canonical church is being persecuted today. I don't think it's going to not survive. I mean, it's survived worse situations. But obviously, as we're looking at this, that doesn't mean that individual people are not suffering. And again, very anecdotally, if you go on social media of some of these even Western Ukrainian churches, and these people are not ethnically Russian, and they're speaking in Ukrainian. I don't think there has sort of been this imposition to force people to speak Ukrainian and kind of more Eastern parts, Russophones to speak Ukrainian. So that certainly happens too. But when you look at the social media, again, very anecdotal, it's not a research study, but just from my perspective, you look at the social media pages at the churches in the west of Ukraine. So these people are likely not ethnic Russians. They're horrified. A lot of them are horrified by what's going on. So they're not like, oh, we want to join Moscow and want to do this and this. They're horrified by what their own government has been doing and what its enforcers, right? It may be the nationalists that are walking around, right? The ultra-nationalists beating on priests, et cetera, et cetera. They're horrified. It's a consistent sentiment that you'll find. You can go yourself, you can use your, auto translator for some of these pages and see what they're saying. Again, very anecdotal, but I think it's at the same time very, very indicative that they themselves cannot believe that this is happening to their church, and it's coming from the government in a supposedly, Ursula's model democracy in the largest country in Europe, right? Completely.
The values.
Yes, the value. What is it? The community of values. I never know what that actually means.
Yeah. Nobody knows. I mean, we come to a.
Well,
it's better not to know because. Yeah, I know it's better not to know because when you actually look at the values that these guys preached. It's better pretend that they don't exist because if they do exist, they're not nice.
Yeah, it's definitely made to sound as generic as possible, but that idea that they're universal and they're applicable to everyone and exportable, I think, is also very notable in terms of the liberal or the post-liberal ideology that's driving it. But yeah, it's definitely interesting to see that level of persecution with literal physical violent attacks that are not one-offs, right? With the bombing of churches in Donbass. And then at the same time, you have this, like I said, Ursula wearing her Ukrainian colors at the European Parliament and giving us completely gaslit statements about, defending Europe and freedom and democracy and all those, keywords that have unfortunately lost their meaning completely. It's definitely very indicative, just completely turning a blind eye. But I mean, they're turning a blind eye on Christians in the Middle East. So it's not surprising. It's the exact same thing in a different region because it doesn't fit their agenda. So.
Exactly. Well, you had the yesterday or the day before, you had also Biden actually pointing out that he was using his Ukrainian tie and his Ukrainian pin and his Ukrainian earrings, whatever he was wearing there.
The current thing.
The current thing is the president of a country, man. It's just. Jesus Christ. I'm so glad I'm not American right now, North American.
Well, I would say in some ways Europe is, I guess it depends where in Europe you are, right? It depends on which country you're in. It depends on whether you're in a large city or in the countryside, because that divide, that periphery versus center is definitely relevant.
A mess. I don't even go there. Here's a mess. As Portuguese, I'm not happy. But Portugal, at least, they people speak out, but Portugal is a small country. Nobody listens.
Right.
People just, shut up. Let's have some.
Right. Exactly. Let's just focus on our daily life, which is what people want to do. They don't want to.
Which is very good in Portugal, actually. They could have better salaries, but it's a pretty decent life there. Good food.
Is your accent very different from, like, as a Brazilian, is your accent very different from going to Portugal?
Yes. Accent, yes. Well, the impression that I have when I hear Portuguese speaking, it sounds a lot to me like they had too much French influence. Yeah, they speak with the closed mouth and between the teeth, and they use a lot of French words.
Well,
Like
30, I just saw the
writers.
statistic. I think it's almost like 30% of English is actually coming from French. So we're
Yeah,
using French
exactly.
words without, in many ways, they've been so anglicized that we no longer recognize them as French. But yeah, there's definitely that influence. But I like the French. I don't like their current politics, but I generally like continental Europe. The UK is a different animal that we're not going to touch upon right now, but I feel like into the grand scheme of things, I think Russia can have a positive relationship with the major countries in continental Europe, like Germany and France, and hopefully that'll happen in my lifetime. So not planning to drop dead yet, but we'll see. So do you want to touch upon a little bit about the sort of the topic of alternative athletic institutions? Do you want to talk a little bit about?
So yeah, so you did we wrap up the church persecution subject? Do you think we went?
Well, I think just the idea that in my maybe optimistic opinion, I think the church in that region will survive and come out stronger. That's a good way to wrap it up. Perhaps I'm being too optimistic, but I think again, in the grand scheme of things, of invasions and crackdowns over a 1,000-year period, it survived specifically right in that Russia/Ukraine. It survived worse things. So perhaps I'm being optimistic, but I think it'll survive this particular challenge as well. At the same time, obviously, none of us wants to see the physical harm, right, coming to the particular church leaders. We don't want them in jail. We don't want them with heart attacks from their criminal investigations that are completely uncalled for. We don't want the churches to be taken over by foreign entities. We don't want the sort of sacred objects to be sold off somewhere to Europe, which is another undercurrent that you hear about. I'm not sure how bad it is in terms of shipping, historical icons into Europe and then auctioning them off. Mm-hmm. There's sort of rumors of that. There are information here and there. I'm not sure how bad that is, but that's another aspect of sort of treating this culture like a for sale store. So, but yeah, I'm optimistic that those two shall pass. But I guess that's my general attitude about other things too. That's why I'm optimistic that Russia and continental Europe will eventually reconcile. It kind of has to, because it's sort of this destiny, geopolitical destiny, geographic destiny. So I'm generally optimistic about these things, despite what the current reality might look like to us.
Yeah, well, seizing, not freezing.
Right.
Well, so yeah, let's move a little just quickly about this BRICS games. That was, to my surprise, it was the third edition. I thought it was the first one.
I know.
It is already the third edition.
Well, I just think the fact that they haven't really received much publicity, and it's sort of been this minor thing, but it's now gaining a little bit of traction. To my liking, it's very slow. I've been screaming for years that we need to do something. We need to do something alternative if the current, big institutions and big events like the Olympics or any of the European championships are so tainted by politics. We need to do something different, and nothing was happening, and it's been very frustrating. So even to even see an announcement coming from Russia that these games are happening in this summer in Kazan is exciting, even though it's I wish it were faster, I wish it were sooner, and I wish it were bigger. But it's sort of a good sign of where things might go. So
well,
what do you think before I get into? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 20 years ago, BRICS was kind of boring, and nobody was giving any kind of it was just these small guys getting together to have some beer or whatever. And 20 years later is the major economy. So there was the needed time. So first of all, let's the Olympic Games were not the worst institution on the worst Western institution. The FIFA World Cup, which is something that the Brazilians love, the FIFA World Cup was not terrible, to be honest. And I don't know if you know, and that I talked about with Angelo this last Monday, I think. That one thing that we are seeing on our side in the IDM is that first of all, the BRICS countries, I mean, basically China and Russia. I'm not going to put Brazil as the big player. And India to a certain level, because India is quite relevant at the moment. So the BRICS countries are trying to fix what it looks to us is they are trying to fix the engines that are already in place. So you have the UN, all the UN, sub entities and all things like that. They are trying to enforce the work of this. And inside the channel, we kind of have a different perspective on that. So Davidson, for his side, he believes that they are going to strongly make the UN work. The United Nations
I think some
work.
people are very pessimistic. They think the UN is essentially, the League of Nations now. It's just not useful at all. It's just this, blah, blah, blah club. I'm a little bit more optimistic. I would actually agree with that. I think some of the mechanisms, they're not ideal, but I think they can be made to work as far as, international law, for better or for worse, operates, if everyone actually adheres by the rules that are in place. And of course, that's been the problem, right? Being able to veto, and the countries that veto are countries that, the winners from World War II, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all kinds of problems with the UN, obviously. But yeah, I'm not completely... I'm definitely disappointed by the UN. I think a lot of people are, but I'm not in the camp that thinks the UN is completely useless. I think it could be fixed with
exactly.
these power players.
Exactly. My personal perspective there is that they are trying to enforce that. They are trying to do that. But then I go a bit further there. I do think that at some point, if they see that they are putting too much energy on trying to fix what could be working, I think they would just create a separate entity. A parallel entity. And, we have two clubs. You join there or you join here. It's up to you. And maybe the UN, maybe then everyone will simply abandon the UN. Sure. When you have this party where the owner of the party is a jackass, people just start getting out, and then someone opens the car trunk and puts some music. We
definitely need to put the headquarters somewhere in Mongolia, somewhere in Eurasia, and not in New York City, and have it much more neutral. I mean, you can't have people prevented, right? Diplomats prevented from traveling to meetings until the last point, as in some ridiculous show of power, as what's been happening to Russian diplomats. You definitely. That just doesn't help anything. I mean, you might be right.
Pressured, because all these guys, their kids go to New York schools. The bank accounts are in New York. All this. So these people, the Russian guy, what's his name? I forgot. So he lives in New York. What if the United States simply look at him and say, look, I know where your children go to school. I know where's your bank account. I know everything about you. At some point, maybe when there comes orders from up, maybe at some point this guy would just say, look, man, my neck's it's on the guillotine here. Just give me a break.
I mean, obviously there are ways to, if you're sort of, if it's happening in your country and you're in charge and you have certain political agenda, there is a way to influence people, for sure. I think the UN should be moved to a completely, or a more neutral, like that's why I said Mongolia, that would be a good place for it. It's kind of a smaller country, but it's in an important location, right? Sort of at the center of Eurasia, right? Next to China, next to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a suggestion. I mean, it could be a totally different country.
It could be Rio de Janeiro. We have beautiful beaches.
Exactly. It could be at a very different place. But I'm not completely I'm not completely pessimistic about it. At the same time, I'm open to the idea of having some alternative institution as well. But yeah, it definitely, you can look at this, the athletic thing, right? You can look at it in a broader way of looking at other institutions that seem to be failing, that are international or global institutions, and the UN would be sort of the most obvious example. But yeah, as far as the, the sports arena goes, obviously sports is a way to show soft power. This is what countries use to, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, to show off their athletes who, are able to perform amazing feats. But definitely this is what, every country uses to the best of their ability. So when you use political means and very sketchy medical means, as far as the quote unquote doping goes, to harm your opponent who is very skilled in a particular area, let's say like tennis or figure skating, but at the same time, athletes from the rules-based order are allowed to use all kinds of exemptions, medical exemptions. I constantly bring up the fact that Scandinavians are allowed to use asthma medicines as an exemption medicine, which is like, are you flipping kidding me? You look at the American gymnast, like, what is her name? Simone Biles, using an ADHD medication, to the point where, like, the most Russophobic publication you can think of, The Economist, a few years ago published this article saying, look at all these athletes, they're using medical exemptions in the West to compete and to perform very well. At the same time, the Russians are being, in my opinion, I mean, not to say that every single Russian ever is this pure, entity. I'm sure there's people who are, individual athletes who might be doping in every country. But there's a particular narrative that's being disseminated about state doping, that it's like the entire country is guilty. It's the sort of like scarlet letter on the forehead of every athlete. Then the ones who have done nothing are being humiliated by not being able to use their flag, their anthem, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this sort of guilt by association. So you have this entire narrative being created. It goes even deeper than that. It goes into like the Cold War stuff. So for instance, I don't know if you remember the Russian tennis player, Maria Sharapova, right? So she's this beautiful blonde, she's this accomplished player. And I think it was like 2016, something around that time, she was accused of using meldonium. And she, which is like a heart medicine, it's pretty harmless. I'm not a medical professional, obviously, but just from what I've read about it. And
don't take that at home out of nowhere.
Well, and then she was sort of penalized. She was taken out of tennis, but at the same time, her sentence was cut down. She was able to return. But the thing about meldonium is it was a medicine that was specific to the former Soviet Union. So when they selected that medicine, it was only about the former Soviet countries. It wasn't something that was being used globally. Please don't tell me this is a coincidence. It's not a flipping coincidence when something like that happens. And then, of course, in the West, in addition to all, can I just finish?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I thought
No, I just wanted to say, in addition to all the medical exemptions, you have all the, biological males competing as females in certain sports, in certain events, instead of creating a separate league for them, which is completely outrageous. And it's being presented. So the medical exemptions plus this being presented as this completely normal thing in the official West. At the same time, Maria Sharapova or someone else is being penalized for using a heart medicine that's specific to the former Soviet Union. I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous. And people who are completely clean, have passed all the tests, are not allowed to participate with their flags because the entire country has been marred by this in a very deliberate political act. I mean, when you put the two and two together, it's absolutely outrageous. But now I'm going to shut up and I'll listen to you.
Sure. No, sorry. Sometimes I forget that you pause to breathe as well. And what I was going to say is that I have athletes in my family, so actual athletes that compete. And the thing about the doping is not that, it's more that they got caught than that they never. I mean, it's they have cycles for that. They all athletes dope, but at cycles. And the thing when they get caught is just that they mistakenly miscalculated the cycle. In general, it's like that. Okay, or something happened that they did not digest properly.
Or they have a medical exemption for ADHD, for asthma. Why are you even competing if you have a serious lung condition?
Asthma.
But I digress. Yeah, it's just really kind of amazing. So yeah, that's definitely, this is not to say that every single person is or isn't doing it, but to kind of make it about an entire country, and then you're literally punishing people who have passed all their medical tests. To me, is outrageous. This is why I think, like I said, I've been screaming for ages on social media from my little platform that we need something different. We need something alternative. That's why I was so excited to see this announcement of the BRICS Games, even though it's the first event in Russia. It's definitely smaller. They have invited people from dozens of countries, and there are dozens of disciplines. Some people are asking, why is chess included? I feel like these are sort of minor details that can be ironed out later on. But the fact that there's some effort being made to something that has been discussed, rather than groveling in front of these bureaucrats that are more interested in humiliation as opposed to being reasonable, it's just not worth it. And I'm glad that there are small baby steps that are being taken towards establishing these institutions, which is not to say that the Olympics cannot be cleaned up. Again, I'm kind of optimistic about these things, or that the BRICS event, BRICS Plus, cannot grow and sort of become the alternative platform, or that it could be sort of the separate thing, like, the Commonwealth Games that I think it's like the UK has had, or whatever.
Yeah.
So
every block, you have the Latin American pre-Olympics, and probably North America. So you have a lot of smaller games than the big Olympic Games. Sure. And as I was saying before, all these entities, they were functional to a certain level until very, very recently, when, as you mentioned, the countries that get banned, or athletes that cannot use their flags or things like that. This is just stupid. This is this is the thing that is going to, because everything else, doping or small things here and there, people would go along with. But when countries started to being forbidden to participate because of political issues, then people are just not up to
But then
that.
other countries that are much worse on these political issues, like bombing the hell out of everyone else, we won't mention who they are, whether it's happening right now or historically, and nothing happens to those athletes, which it shouldn't, because they're not responsible for their government.
Exactly.
But they're not being questioned, they're not being harassed by so-called journalists about, what do you think about your president doing this and that. They're just performing because that's their job, and this is this is where they excel. So when it's sort of, you kind of see that glaring contrast between, whom it happens to and who is doing it, the whole whom situation, then, things become pretty obvious. But yeah, you're right. Even though there were failures and faults to all these institutions, they were fairly functional up until maybe 10 years ago, I would say. Like even with the boycotts of the Olympics that happened during the Cold War, generally athletes were not being treated in this way. Unless I'm missing something, I don't remember the Soviet athletes not being able to routinely not carry their flag because of some conflict with the US, back in the Cold War days. With obviously there was the boycott, like I said, of the Moscow Olympics, but that's a little bit different than humiliating people for doing absolutely nothing other than belonging to a certain country and doing their job at which they excel in the sports arena. So yeah.
The boycott is different. Alex Christoforou made a good analysis on this once, because the boycott is something that the country decides to do.
Exactly.
I don't want to participate in that. I don't believe in that. I don't want to be with these people. Well, you have the right to do so. When an entity forbade,
forbids. You can say forbids or bans. Bans.
Yeah, bans are better. When an entity bans a country to join the Olympics, that's different. That's that's some type of imperial power.
Well, when it engages in collective punishment, whether it was over doping or whether it's over the escalation in the war in Ukraine, while there are other conflicts going on around the world and the aggressors in those conflicts are not being treated in the same way. I mean, the contrast is very glaring. So like I said, I am not expecting this to replace the Olympics or to be this absolutely grandiose event, but Russia has been known to host really well organized sports events, whether it was Sochi, whether it was, the World Cup, or sort of some of the more regional events. And I'm sure they'll do a good job. But to me, it's just the first, baby step. And I'm just happy to see something happening after, years of unnecessary humiliation. Just like stop groveling in front of these people, just leave. I mean, I understand for athletes, it's really a serious decision where this is where they perform, because ultimately they represent a country, but they also want to represent themselves. And to them, it's like, I would rather perform as me than not perform at all, because this is my life's dream. I'm amazing at this sport. So I understand all that, but at some point you can't just go on and be, routinely embarrassed, ashamed, and humiliated for something you haven't done. It's just absolutely outrageous. So yeah, I don't know why I'm feeling so emotional about this topic. It's just very, very, very frustrating. Something that seems very fixable. Like it's not sort of like a global, catastrophe, like a war or a persecution of the church, but it's still an important issue. And yeah, it's a frustrating issue that has solutions that haven't been implemented yet. And I feel like maybe slowly they're going to be implemented. But yeah, that's my take on this.
There's a lot of people that say that sports build bridges. So when you see such entity being,
used to blow up bridges.
I understand your emotion. So I think we kind of covered the terrain. Do you want to make some last comments for wrapping this up?
Thank you for watching. Like I said, our tech genius is responsible for all of it. So please follow him on social media. He does a lot of interesting content unrelated to me, and he has very interesting guests, to some of whom he referred today.
Including Nina.
Thank you. We will be back next week with sort of a mix of history and current events, and we will see you soon. Thank you for watching, guys. Bye.
See you guys. Bye-bye.